Welcome to my presentation on dyslexia. My name is Mariana Herrera Dominguez. Thank you for joining me. So first things first, we're going to talk about the 21st century definition of dyslexia. As we know, in the world of psychology, things are constantly evolving and there's research done on this subject to this date. So dyslexia is directly related with a language learning disability. And usually when a person is assessed, it usually falls under the category specific learning disability related to phonological awareness. It's neurobiological in origin, and it has to do with difficulties with accurately and fluently recognizing words and poor spelling patterns and decoding abilities. This may include problems in reading comprehension, and I put the word may because it really goes case by case. It is usual that it will impact reading comprehension because, as we know as educators, reading comprehension is directly related with how accurately we read, how fluently we read, if we read with prosody, etc. But it's not every case. So every student is unique. So there are three categories that we must take into consideration in order to truly understand phonological processing. So the first one is phonological memory. Then we have phonological awareness that I was talking about, naming speed. And then within phonological awareness, we have phonemic awareness, which is related to phoneme blending, phoneme segmentation, and phoneme manipulation. So these are really important, and the person might be impacted by having difficulties in these three categories. And I'm going to talk about that in later slides in terms of like grade levels as well. So as I mentioned, it has to do with difficulties with phonological processing. And I really love this image because it's, these are evidence-based practices in which we see the image of the brain patterns that dyslexic students may show and the brain patterns that non-dyslexic students may show as well. So I like that there's the word may because that's the complexity of dyslexia and everyone's brain is different, but usually these are the things that we will see. In terms of areas of concern, some people call them weaknesses. We usually don't use that language anymore in psychology. We talk about strengths and areas of concern. So you can see that there's evident areas of concern, but that doesn't mean that a person with dyslexia is not going to exhibit strengths. They will. And because they have those areas of concern, they're going to make up for it with strengths. And their strengths may be so fantastic that it really brings out other abilities, correct? And this just goes to any human, whether you're dyslexic or not. So I find that really interesting. So when we talk about dyslexia, we talk about neural signatures, and these can change with intervention. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? If you're experiencing difficulties in something and then there's an intervention takes place, an intervention that is consistent with what your needs are and aligned with your goals, then things may change for the better, correct? Another interesting fact is that these neural signatures may be present even in gifted students. So what happens when, gifted students have some difficulties in terms of their reading and writing skills and oral language and all of this, they might fall under the radar because they're gifted students. So those are some of the things that we have to look out for in order for us to really cater to students, whether they're gifted or not. So as I mentioned before, right, dyslexia must be understood as a language learning disability. And there's a connection between dyslexia and delayed speech or language development. Again, this goes case by case, but when this happens, it's because we understand dyslexia as a language learning disability, and that's why there's a connection between these two. So one of my favorite parts of the presentation, the characteristics of dyslexia. by age group, strengths, and areas of concern. So some indicators of dyslexia within preschool age children will be they have difficulties with recognizing their own names in print. They will have difficulties with rhyming patterns. They will generally have a lack of interest in books, and they will just have difficulties with understanding instruction when it has to do with any of these things. So we're going to start seeing, preschool age children kind of, not being able to recognize their name in print and all of these things. And those might be signs. But, and I know that I've said this before, right? It really goes case by case, and it's just seeing every single detail in terms of not worrying if a child takes a little longer to learn certain things, but these are the indicators that there might be some difficulties there. And then students in kinder through first grade, again, in school, they're gonna have difficulties with segmenting, blending, substituting, things that they're already learning in the classroom and they're practicing at home. They're gonna have frequent confusion with words that look alike, like what and want, for example. And they're gonna have difficulty remembering our orthographic patterns that they're already learning in the classroom. Their memory word bank might be affected as well, right? Because in these grade levels and throughout school, we're learning different sight words, correct? And of course, they increase their difficulty by grade level. So students from second grade through eighth grade, and this is very generalized, but they'll have a poor history of reading skills when they have the opportunity to do some independent reading. They will choose books that are way below their grade level or age appropriate. They'll have a lack of awareness in word structure. They will have difficulties, of course, with multisyllabic words. They'll have a frequent omission of entire syllables when they're reading. And like I mentioned, they'll have frequent errors in reading common sight words that are appropriate for their age and grade level. So in students in high school and then throughout college, their difficulties are going to be a little bit different. Of course, difficulties in general with reading and writing appropriate to their age, but they'll have like constant complications with like lack of awareness of word structure again, and frequent errors, and like again, sight words are appropriate for their age and grade level. They're going to have a lot of difficulties with tasks that have to do with things that they have to do on their independent level for their age. As students grow, there's a little bit of more dependency on the teacher and certain structures that take place in the classroom. And as things evolve, of course, students need structure in the classroom. But when they're in college, you do a lot of independent work. And so these things might become very, very difficult and challenging. So this is actually my favorite part of the presentation. What are the strengths observed in students with dyslexia that research has shown us? And there's so many. I'm going to show a list that is not very long, but I find this fascinating. So one of the things that are the strengths that are observed in students is they have curiosity. A lot of them have advanced maturity level because they're used to being problem solvers because they encounter these difficulties. They have talent in building objects. They have great imagination. They have eagerness to embrace new ideas. So it's interesting because even though we see that there are these areas of concern, the brain will always try and say, okay, this is the area of concern, but these are my strengths, and this is how I'm going to tackle this. So it's really interesting. Some students have demonstrated the ability to replicate, three-dimensional models, right? They have strong thinking skills in terms of reasoning, conceptualization, and imagination. And my particular favorite is they usually have really good listening skills, which is a great asset because, as we know, there are many adults walking around on earth that are not dyslexic and they do not have good listening comprehension skills. But students with dyslexia, research has shown that a lot of them do. So what are the social emotional factors of dyslexia? This is really important because when a student doesn't have access to the interventions that they need in order to succeed in school and within their personal life, then they can show signs of anxiety. They worry that they might be ridiculed by others, and that is a completely valid feeling to have, right? At any age, whether you're in grade school or you're in college. And some of them might exhibit avoidance and depression. So this is why it's very important to tackle the needs of students while they're in school. And so there are effective approaches for teaching students with dyslexia. These are the things that need to take place in the classroom in order for the students to succeed, right? So it really speaks for itself. Systematic and cumulative. Well, it just means that you need every lesson needs to be organized, it needs to be explicit. Teachers must be adept for individualized instruction, it can be very, very difficult, right? Because you might have 28 or 30 students in a classroom. And we're going to talk about the tier 1, the tier 2, and the tier 3 students. But these are the characteristics that really need to take place in order to support students. And of course, these are evidence-based teaching principles. So effective approaches for teaching students with dyslexia. Well, obviously all students should receive universal support. Some students will need supplemental support and a few students will need individualized support. This is a lot of times, and this is a California multi-tier system of support. Sometimes when we talk about the levels of support, the pyramid might be inverted, in which case we need to support the teacher with their instructional strategies and maybe a few humans supporting the classroom in order for the students to succeed and the teacher to also be successful in their instruction. So there's a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration, and especially, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we're talking about the 21st century, right? Things that were not taken into consideration back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even the 2000s, and in some places even today. We need to talk about our bilingual students, our English language learners. We need to talk about the economic factors that take place for a student to succeed. Does the school have proper funding? Do the parents have the support that they need in order to support their child? Because parents always want the best for their children, and so do the teachers. What are the levels of support that the community is receiving in general, not only the educational institution, but the family, the child, everything is connected. In which ways does the child learn? What are their strengths? What are their areas of concern? What is their motivation to learn as well? And I think that's what's very difficult about teaching, is really an art, because you really have to motivate your students and also find their interest in order to make the lessons engaging. So this is really important. And this is why, becoming a teacher in California, there's so many requirements and there's so many things that the teachers have to go through in order to cater to their students. So California credentialed teachers have to pass a test called the RICA. And these concepts are very clear to California teachers, right? It's a test that looks at all of these concepts listed here, and that they have to have clarity on these concepts in order to teach a child or a young adult how to read and write, how to listen to instruction, all of these things. And this is another interesting component. We also need to talk about special education and 504 plans. So this is pretty clear cut. You know, a student that has dyslexia is not necessarily gonna qualify for special education. And this can be a little confusing, right? Because a student that is dyslexic, you're like, oh, wait a minute, this child needs to go to special education. Not necessarily. Putting a child automatically in special education because they're dyslexic might be a disservice to the student. We want to make sure that the student receives the level of supports that they need. So this might not be through an IEP. This might be through a 504 plan. This might be through different types of interventions that need to take place in the classroom. So there's different levels of support. And as school psychologists, we do want to make sure that the child is being supported, but you do not want to place a child in somewhere where they don't belong, right? Because that would be a disservice. So as we know, 504 plans is the Act of 1973, and it protects students with disabilities from discrimination based on their disability. So a student who doesn't qualify for an IEP, including a student for dyslexia, may be entitled to a protection under Section 504, which is great because the 504 plan is a legal document that binds the school into saying, okay, you know what? Timothy is going to need visual supports in the classroom. Timothy is going to need some manipulatives for this because he's just this, it's a visual learner and he needs some kinesthetics. Timothy, and it's those details that it's a contract that the family and the school agrees to in order to cater to the student, because at the end of the day, both the institution and the parents will want the best for the student. But that doesn't mean that they will end up receiving services through an IEP, because that might be a disservice, right? We don't want to place a student in a group where, you know, they're learning their letter sounds and this child is already decoding. So that's just one very simple example around that. And there are many strengths observed in student-assisted technology, right? So through the use of technology, students can receive different supports to eliminate barriers to learning, so they can become more productive and more successful. So it keeps them in technology. Through the use of technology, it allows the child to become more independent in their schoolwork and in their homework as well. And when I say homework, I don't mean, I guess I use the terminology as the work that you do home, but I actually, research has shown that homework doesn't do much for children, but I mean like anything that they want to do in terms of like reading and writing at home. And so just finally, a little bit of information for parents and guardians. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to feel nervous. It's okay to be confused at the beginning, just learning about dyslexia. At the end of the day, as educators in public education, we are here to support the students, and therefore we are here to support the families as well through this whole process. And I really appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen to this presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you.